I was standing at the altar in my wedding dress 20 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle when 2 police officers walked into the bridal suite and asked me if I knew anything about a drug operation being run out of my apartment. My hands were still shaking from doing my own eyeliner. My mother was behind me adjusting my veil. And for 3 full seconds nobody said anything. Not me. Not my mom. Not the officers. Because I did know something. I knew exactly who had called them. My sister had been planning this moment for months, and she'd chosen my wedding day to detonate it. What she didn't know was that my father had been quietly building a case against her for almost as long. And in 20 minutes in front of 200 guests, he was going to use it. This is the story of the day my sister tried to destroy my wedding and the day my father finally chose me. If you're new here, hit subscribe because these stories only get more insane from here. Let's get into it. My name is Rachel. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life I was the reasonable one in my family. The one who didn't cause problems. The one who called on Sundays, remembered birthdays, and never ever pushed back, because pushing back wasn't really an option in my house growing up. My sister Vanessa is 2 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, she was the center of gravity in our family. Not because she was cruel exactly at first. She was just first. First grandchild. First to walk, first to talk, first to get the good grades, first to get engaged. And somewhere along the way my parents built an entire identity around being Vanessa's parents. I don't think they ever set out to do that. I think it just happened the way water finds the lowest point in a room. I didn't resent her for it when I was a kid. I actually adored her. I used to sit outside her bedroom door just to hear her talk on the phone. I wore her hand-me-downs like they were couture. When she left for college, I cried for 2 days. Things started shifting when I was around 22. I'd just graduated and taken a job at a small marketing agency, nothing glamorous, but it was mine and I was proud of it. Vanessa, meanwhile, had dropped out of her master's program for the second time and moved back in with our parents to regroup. That word regroup became a permanent fixture in our house for the next several years. Here's the thing about Vanessa that took me a long time to fully understand. She needed to be the version of the story where things happened to her never because of her. Every job she lost was because her boss was threatened by her talent. Every relationship that ended was because the guy couldn't handle a strong woman. Every financial hole she dug, and there were many, was somehow a symptom of the world being unfair to her specifically. And my parents believed her. Every time. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not telling you this story because I think I'm better than my sister. I'm telling you this story because I spent almost a decade making myself smaller, so she could stay big, and I need you to understand exactly how small I'd gotten by the time this all happened, so you understand exactly what it meant when my father finally stood up. By the time I was 26, I'd learned the family rules without anyone ever stating them out loud. Rule 1. Never celebrate something good happening to you around Vanessa unless you're prepared to immediately downplay it. Rule 2. If Vanessa is struggling, whatever you're going through takes a back seat. No exceptions. Rule 3. Do not under any circumstances imply, even accidentally, that Vanessa might be responsible for her own problems. I broke Rule 3 exactly once when I was 27. Vanessa had borrowed $4,000 from our parents to invest in a business opportunity that turned out to be a multi-level marketing skincare scheme. When it collapsed, as those things do, she told everyone the company had scammed her. I made the mistake of gently asking in front of my mom whether she'd done any research before wiring the money. My mother didn't yell at me. She didn't have to. She just went very quiet, got a certain look on her face, and said, "Your sister is going through something. This isn't the time." It was never the time. So I stopped bringing things up. I got quieter. I got smaller. I moved 40 minutes away, which felt like putting an ocean between us. I met Daniel. Out of all places, a tile store. I was there picking out backsplash samples for an apartment renovation I couldn't really afford, and he was there for work. He does architectural restoration, mostly historic homes. He caught me dropping an entire sample board of subway tile on my foot and laughing about it instead of swearing, and he said that told him everything he needed to know about me. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. I want to tell you about Daniel because he matters enormously to this story, not just as the fiancé, but because he was the first person in my adult life who looked at the dynamic in my family and said out loud, "That's not normal, Rachel." The first time he met Vanessa, we were at a family dinner, and she spent 45 minutes talking about a toxic ex-coworker who had sabotaged a project she was leading. When we got in the car afterward, Daniel was quiet for a minute, And then he asked carefully, "Does she talk about literally everyone like that?" I laughed it off. I said, "You get used to it." He said, "I don't think you should have to." That sentence rearranged something in me. Slowly over the 2 years we dated, I started noticing things I'd normalized my entire life. The way Vanessa needed to insert herself into any good news. The way she'd ask about my relationship not because she was happy for me, but the way you'd check a competitor's stock price. The way my parents' phone calls to me always somehow ended up being about her. When Daniel proposed on a dumb perfect Tuesday, no big production, just us on the back porch of the house he'd been slowly restoring for us to move into, I called my mom before I even finished crying. She was thrilled. Genuinely, I think, in the moment. She put my dad on the phone and I heard him say in his quiet way, "That's my girl." I called Vanessa an hour later. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Wow. Okay. That's wow. So soon." We'd been together for 2 years. I didn't say anything. "I just mean," she continued, "you guys haven't even lived together yet, right? I just want you to be careful. I don't want you rushing into something because you're scared of being alone." I was 29 years old, financially independent, in a stable 2-year relationship with a man who had never once raised his voice at me, and my sister was worried I was rushing because I was scared of being alone. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, turning it over, trying to figure out if there was a version of it that came from love. I never found one. That was the beginning. I just didn't know it yet. If you've ever planned a wedding while a family member is quietly working against you, you know it's a specific kind of exhausting because you can't point to any single thing. It's never a scene. It's 100 small cuts, each one deniable on its own. It started with the dress. I asked Vanessa to come dress shopping with me and my mom because despite everything she was still my sister, and some stubborn part of me kept hoping she'd show up for this one thing. She came. She sat in the corner of the boutique on her phone for most of it, and when I came out in the dress, I ended up buying a simple fitted ivory gown, nothing dramatic. She looked up just long enough to say, "Careful, that silhouette isn't the most forgiving." My mother laughed the way you laugh to defuse something. I forced a smile. The stylist, bless her, said nothing and just adjusted my train. Then it was the venue. Then the guest list. Vanessa wanted to add 6 friends of hers I'd never met and got genuinely angry, actual raised voice angry, when I said our budget didn't allow it. Then it was a comment my mother relayed back to me secondhand about how she thought it was a little much that I'd asked Daniel's sister to be my maid of honor instead of her. I want to pause here and say, I did consider asking Vanessa. I sat with that decision for weeks. But by that point I had genuinely started to feel like having her in that role, standing beside me on the most important day of my life, holding my flowers, giving a toast, would mean handing her a microphone I couldn't predict. I told myself I was being paranoid. I asked Daniel's sister instead. I've never regretted it, but at the time it felt like committing an act of war I hadn't meant to declare. Vanessa didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after that. When she resurfaced, it was with a group text to the whole family about how she'd been going through a hard time and needed everyone's support, with no explanation of what the hard time actually was. My mother predictably organized a family dinner to check on her. I went. I always went. At that dinner my father did something unusual. He didn't say much. My dad has never been a big talker, he's an engineer, precise and careful with words, but at one point when Vanessa was in the middle of a story about how unfairly she'd been treated at her new job, her 4th in 3 years, I saw him glance at me. Just a flicker. And in that flicker I thought I saw something I hadn't seen from him in a long time. He saw it too. I didn't know yet how much he'd been quietly watching. I didn't know he'd started keeping a folder. 6 weeks before the wedding I got a call from my Aunt Carol, my dad's sister, someone I love, but who has never once in her life kept a secret successfully. She called under the guise of asking about centerpiece colors, and about 4 minutes into the call she said, "So, I heard some concerning things about Daniel's business. Is everything okay?" I had no idea what she meant. Daniel restores historic homes. He has a small crew, does beautiful, meticulous work, and makes an honest, modest living doing it. I asked her what she'd heard. She hesitated, then told me. Vanessa had mentioned at a family gathering I hadn't attended that she was worried about where Daniel's money actually came from. That the renovation business didn't add up financially. That she'd heard from where she didn't specify that there might be other things going on. She'd apparently used the word cautious, a lot, the way people do when they want you to fill in the worst possible blank yourself without them ever having to say it. I got off the phone with my aunt and sat completely still for probably 10 minutes. Then I called my mother and I asked her point blank, Had Vanessa said anything like this to her? There was a long pause. She's just worried about you, my mother finally said. She loves you. She wants to make sure you're being careful. Careful. That word again. I asked my mother directly whether she believed there was anything wrong with Daniel's business. No, of course not, she said quickly. Too quickly. But you know your sister. She notices things. What Vanessa had noticed, it turned out I pieced this together over the following weeks, was that Daniel had made 2 large cash deposits into our joint wedding account. Cash he'd been paid legally and traceably by a longtime client who preferred paying that way for a bathroom restoration project, an elderly widow who didn't trust electronic banking and had done business that way with Daniel's family for 15 years. It was unusual, but it was completely legitimate, easily documented, and something I could have explained in about 90 seconds if anyone had simply asked me. Nobody asked me. Vanessa had decided apparently on her own that this was suspicious, and instead of asking a single question, she'd spent 6 weeks quietly seeding doubt through the family, to my aunt, to cousins, to anyone who would listen, dressed up as concern. I confronted her directly. I called her and asked her straight out if she'd been telling people she thought Daniel's business was illegitimate. She didn't deny it. She said, and I remember this almost word for word, I just think it's weird that a guy who fixes up old houses is suddenly flush with cash right before your wedding, and I'm allowed to have questions. I'm your sister. I'm supposed to look out for you. I told her the truth, the client, the widow, the 15 years of business history, and the documentation Daniel could produce in 5 minutes. She said, okay. If you say so. If you say so. Not, I'm sorry. Not, that makes sense, my mistake. Just enough doubt left hanging in the air to make sure the seed she'd planted kept growing on its own, no further watering required. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in this entire process, I cried, not because I was scared of the rumor, but because I finally understood completely, and without any more room for denial, that my sister was not going to let me have this. Whatever this needed to be for her to feel okay at my wedding, my happiness was not going to be allowed to exist without her finding some way to insert a shadow into it. What I didn't know yet was that the rumor about Daniel's business was just the opening move. I need to back up here and tell you about my father, because everything that happened on my wedding day only makes sense once you understand what he'd quietly been doing for almost a year. My dad, David, spent 31 years as a structural engineer. If you know engineers, you know they don't operate on feelings, they operate on evidence. My whole life I watched him defer to my mother on anything emotional, anything involving Vanessa, anything that required navigating the messy, illogical terrain of family dynamics. He kept the peace by staying quiet. I used to think it was a weakness. I understand now it was something closer to patience. He was watching catalogs, waiting for a pattern to become undeniable even to my mother. About a year before my wedding, my dad co-signed a small business loan for Vanessa, her 5th fresh start, this time a boutique event planning company. He told me later that something about the paperwork bothered him from the start. Expenses that didn't map cleanly to any actual events, invoices to vendors. He'd never heard her mention a business account that seemed to function more like a personal slush fund than an operating business. Being the person he is, my dad didn't confront her. He started keeping records. Bank statements. Screenshots of texts where she asked him for just one more advance. A running document. Aunt Carol let this slip to me months later, not realizing how significant it was that he'd apparently started calling privately the folder. He never told me about any of it. Not once in the entire lead up to my wedding did he say a single word to me about what he was tracking. I found out later that he'd made a decision early on. He wasn't going to blow up the family over suspicions. He needed proof. And more than that, he told me this himself weeks after the wedding in one of the most honest conversations we've ever had. He needed to see with total clarity whether Vanessa would eventually turn that same pattern of blame shifting and financial recklessness on someone who couldn't defend herself the way he could. He didn't know it would be me. He didn't know it would be my wedding day. But when Aunt Carol called him days after she called me, repeating the same concerns about Daniel's finances that Vanessa had been spreading, my father, for the first time in this entire saga, decided to actually investigate. Not me. Not Daniel. Vanessa. It took him 72 hours to find the first real inconsistency. A series of transfers out of the event planning business account into Vanessa's personal account, timed suspiciously close to the exact weeks she'd been telling my mother she was too broke to contribute anything toward wedding-related family costs, while simultaneously funding a trip to Cabo she'd posted about, tagged self-care, 10 days before my wedding. My father is not a dramatic man. But he told me later that seeing that timeline laid out side by side with dates and dollar amounts next to the rumor campaign about Daniel was the moment something in him finally closed. Not exploded. Closed quietly and completely, like a door being locked from the inside. He didn't tell me any of this before the wedding. He didn't want to hand me one more thing to carry into a day that was supposed to be mine. He just made sure that if Vanessa was going to bring a weapon to my wedding, he'd already know exactly where the safety was. The morning of my wedding, I woke up at 6 a.m. in a hotel suite with my mother, Daniel's sister, and 2 friends, and for the first 2 hours, everything was genuinely unbelievably perfect. Mimosas. Music. My mother crying while doing my hair, the good kind of crying. For a while I actually let myself forget the last 6 months. Vanessa arrived around 9 later than everyone else, in a mood I recognized instantly, the tight performed pleasantness she used when she was sitting on something. She complimented my dress. She hugged me. She said all the right words. But there was a current underneath it, the kind you learn to read after 30 years of living next to someone's storms. Around 11, hair and makeup nearly finished, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a cousin I wasn't especially close to. "Hey random, but is everything okay? Vanessa just posted something weird in the family group chat, and then deleted it fast. Didn't want you to see it out of context if someone screenshots it later." My stomach dropped in the specific way it does when you already know before you know. I didn't have time to chase it down. My mother took my phone away gently but firmly and said the words every bride has heard 1,000 times. "Not today. Whatever it is, not today." I let her. I put my phone in a drawer. I finished getting ready. At 12:40 I put on my dress. At 1 o'clock the photographer started taking pictures. At 1:20, 20 minutes before the ceremony, someone knocked on the door of the bridal suite. It was the venue coordinator, and behind her 2 uniformed police officers. I want to describe this moment exactly as it happened, because I've replayed it so many times I could probably narrate it in my sleep. The coordinator's face was carefully neutral, in the way people trained in hospitality get very good at. She said there'd been a report, and the officers needed to speak with the family briefly before the ceremony could proceed. My mother went white. My hands, which had been perfectly steady all morning, started shaking so badly one of my bridesmaids had to hold my bouquet. The lead officer was calm, almost apologetic. He explained that they'd received a call, a tip he called it, alleging that a small quantity of narcotics was being stored and distributed out of a residential address associated with the bride, meaning me, and that the caller had specifically flagged that today would be a good time to investigate because everyone relevant would be together in one place. Everyone relevant would be together in one place. That phrase told me everything before anyone said another word. This wasn't a concerned citizen. This wasn't a mistake. This was designed. Someone had picked this exact day, this exact hour, because they knew it would humiliate me in front of every person I loved at the precise moment I was most powerless to do anything about it. The officer asked if he could speak with me directly. I said yes. He asked whether I had any knowledge of drug activity at my residence. I said no, truthfully, immediately, without a flicker of hesitation, because there was nothing to hesitate about. He asked a few more procedural questions. I answered all of them. Within about 6 minutes it was clear to him, I could see it settle into his posture, that this had the shape of a false report, not a real one. But 6 minutes in a wedding dress, 20 minutes before your ceremony, with your mother sobbing behind you and your bridesmaids frozen in the doorway, is an eternity. It was at that moment, precisely that moment, that my father walked in. I have never in 31 years seen my father move with the kind of controlled, deliberate speed he had walking into that room. He didn't raise his voice. He introduced himself to the officers, asked calmly if he could have a private word, and stepped just outside the door with them. I found out afterward from the lead officer himself, because my father insisted he tell me directly, wanting me to hear it from someone other than him about what happened in that hallway. My father told the officers plainly that he believed he knew exactly who had placed the call, and that he had reason to believe it was a malicious false report, not a good faith tip. He told them he had documentation, financial records showing a pattern of instability, and more relevantly a text message he'd received 11 days earlier from his other daughter Vanessa, in which she'd written verbatim, "You'll regret picking her over me. You'll see." He'd kept that text. He hadn't known what it meant when he got it. He knew exactly what it meant now. He also told them something else, something I didn't find out until much later, and something that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. He told the officers that if they traced the call, he had every reason to believe it would come back to a number registered to Vanessa, and that he wanted them to know on record that as her father, he was not going to protect her from the consequences of that. The officers thanked him and confirmed there was no evidence at my residence warranting further action that day, and this part still stuns me. I did trace the call before they left the property as a courtesy, given the seriousness of a false report to law enforcement. It had come from Vanessa's phone made 40 minutes earlier from the parking lot of the venue itself. She hadn't even left. She'd made the call, and then walked inside to watch it happen. My father came back into that room, knelt down in front of me in my wedding dress, not standing over me the way he'd stood over everything my whole life, and he said, "It's handled. Nobody is walking you down this aisle today except me, and nobody is taking this day from you. Not her. Not anyone." I asked him, shaking, if it had really been Vanessa. He nodded once. It was her. And I already knew some of what she'd been doing before this. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. I want to tell you that I fell apart after that. Some part of me expected to. But something strange happened instead. A kind of clarity settled over me the way it does after you've been holding your breath underwater for so long that finally breaking the surface doesn't feel like relief. It feels like arriving somewhere new. My mother, who I think at that moment finally fully understood what she'd been enabling for years, helped me fix my mascara without saying a word, of tears streaming down her own face the entire time. My bridesmaids reassembled around me like nothing had ever threatened to knock us off course. And 25 minutes later than scheduled, the music started, and my father walked me down the aisle. Vanessa was not in the room. She'd left the property before the ceremony began, whether out of shame, fear of the police returning, or simple cowardice, I still don't fully know, and honestly I've stopped needing to know. I married Daniel in front of 180 of the 200 people who were supposed to be there, and I can tell you without exaggeration that it was the most beautiful day of my life anyway. Not despite what happened. In a strange way, because of what happened, and because of what my father did in the middle of it. During his toast, my dad, a man who has never given an emotional speech in his life, who once described his own father's funeral eulogy as adequate, set down his note cards halfway through, looked at me, and said something I will remember until the day I die. I spent a long time thinking my job as a father was to keep the peace. I'm learning later than I should have that sometimes keeping the peace just means asking one daughter to keep shrinking so the other one never has to grow up. Rachel, I'm sorry it took me this long. But I want everyone in this room to know, I see you. I've always seen you. And today of all days I chose you, and I will keep choosing you. There wasn't a dry eye in that tent. My mother was sobbing. Daniel's mother, who'd never met me before that week, was sobbing. I was absolutely destroyed in the best possible way. I won't pretend the aftermath was simple. Filing a false police report is a real crime, and my father, after a long and painful conversation with my mother, made the decision to let the investigation proceed rather than intervene to protect Vanessa from it. She was charged. She received a fine and probation. The district attorney's office ultimately viewed it as a first offense driven by acute personal crisis, rather than genuine malice toward public safety, which legally is probably the right call. Morally, I have more complicated feelings about it, but I've made peace with not needing the justice system to fully capture what she did to me. My relationship with Vanessa, as you might imagine, has not recovered. We haven't spoken since that day. I've heard secondhand that she's told her version of events to whoever will listen, that she was worried, that things got out of hand, that I've always been the family's favorite, and this was somehow in her telling still about me getting special treatment. I've stopped trying to correct the story. Some people will never let you own your own narrative, and at some point you have to decide that's their loss, not yours. My relationship with my parents, especially my father, changed permanently, and for the better. My mom and I are rebuilding something more honest than what we had before. It's slow, but it's real. My dad and I talk every week, now real conversations, not just logistics. He still has the folder, by the way. He showed it to me once months later. Pages and pages of quiet, careful documentation built by a man who didn't know how to say, "I love you," out loud, but apparently knew exactly how to prove it when it mattered most. Daniel and I are coming up on our first anniversary. We talk about that day, sometimes not with anger anymore, mostly with a strange kind of gratitude, which I know sounds insane. But it clarified everything. It showed me exactly who was willing to lie to a room full of 200 people to keep me small, and exactly who was willing to walk into that room and make sure nobody ever could again. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. The people who claim to love you the most while consistently working against you are not confused, and they are not misunderstood. They know exactly what they're doing. The only real question is whether the people around you, the ones who are supposed to protect you, will finally see it too, and whether they'll choose to act when it matters instead of just quietly agreeing with you in private forever. My father waited a long time to act. But when he finally did, he didn't just save my wedding day. He gave me back years of myself I didn't even know I'd been rationing out to keep the peace. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever had to fight for a seat at your own table, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because trust me, this isn't even close to the craziest one I've got.